The evening flight had taken off in the same routine as any other. Todd sat comfortably in his seat in economy class, fastening his seatbelt. He had a book in his hand, but reading soon fell by the wayside when he noticed the intensity of the clouds forming outside. Lightning flashed across the sky from time to time, illuminating the dark clouds gathering in the distance. The cabin was silent, except for the slight hum of the engines and the occasional murmur from the passengers. Todd observed the passengers around him, noting their mixture of indifference and restlessness. Some were dozing quietly, while others seemed more attentive, looking out of the windows or at their electronic devices. The flight was only a few hours long, but the storm seemed determined to make every minute longer than the last. A sudden pop of turbulence made the plane shake, and Todd instinctively grabbed the arms of his seat. The pilot's calm voice soon came over the PA system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have encountered an area of unexpected turbulence. We ask that you all remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. We are in contact with air traffic control to adjust our route, and we hope to clear this area soon. Thank you for your understanding." The pilot's voice was reassuring, but Todd noticed something different, an almost imperceptible hesitation, as if not even the pilot was completely sure of his words. This only increased Todd's unease. He looked out of the window again, seeing only darkness and the occasional flash of lightning. As he tried to calm down, Todd saw a flight attendant approaching from the corridor, talking quietly to another crew member. They seemed tense, casting quick glances at the control monitors above their seats. He couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but he could see the worried expression on their faces. Something wasn't right. The turbulence increased, causing the plane to shake again. Todd felt his stomach churn, a combination of fear and nervousness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to control his breathing. When he opened them, he noticed that the communication lights on the panel above his seat were flashing irregularly, as if they were failing. The tension in the cabin seemed almost palpable. Todd could feel the unease spreading through the passengers, and his own apprehension was growing by the second. There was something different about this storm, something he couldn't explain, but which put him on alert. He wondered what was really going on in the cockpit, and whether everyone on board was as safe as the pilot wanted them to believe. The first chapter set the somber tone for the flight, a journey that promised to be uneventful, but was now steeped in mystery and uncertainty. Todd prepared for what could be a long night, unaware that the next few hours would be marked by events he would never forget. The turbulence showed no signs of abating. Todd wriggled in his seat, trying to find a comfortable position, but every jolt from the plane made him grip the arms of the seat tightly. All around him, the passengers were visibly restless. Murmurs and whispers filled the air, while many looked at the flight attendants for signs of reassurance. Todd observed a flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with blonde hair tied up in a tight bun, walking down the aisle. Her face was tense, and she checked passengers' seatbelts with an expression of someone who wished she were anywhere else. From time to time, she exchanged worried glances with her colleagues. There was something unspoken between them, a subtle fear that only became visible in the lines of their faces when they thought no one was looking. As the plane moved through the storm, Todd noticed that the communication lights on the panel above his seat continued to flash erratically. Sometimes they would go out completely, leaving the cabin darker than usual, only to come back on again, flashing frantically. This didn't seem normal, but Todd wondered if it could just be the result of the turbulence. Trying to shake off the growing discomfort, Todd picked up his book again, but the words on the page made no sense. His mind was focused on what was happening on board. He then put the book back in his seat pocket and looked around. Some passengers were trying to sleep, their heads falling to one side, but most were awake, nervously looking at the windows or fidgeting restlessly in their seats. An announcement interrupted the background noise in the cabin, and the pilot's voice came over the loudspeakers. This time, there was a noticeable tension. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the continued turbulence. We are experiencing some technical difficulties with our communication systems. Please remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. Our crew is working to resolve the situation, and we assure you that everyone's safety is our priority." Todd felt a chill run down his spine. Technical difficulties with the communication systems? That didn't sound good at all. He tried to remember if he had heard of anything like this on previous flights, but nothing came to mind. What was going on? The flight attendant Todd had observed earlier stopped next to him, checking his seatbelt with a worried look on her face. Todd couldn't contain his curiosity and asked quietly, "Is something wrong? I heard the pilot's announcement about the communication failures." The flight attendant forced a smile, but her eyes betrayed her nervousness. "It's just a minor technical glitch. We're in contact with air traffic control and they're aware. Everything will be fine." Todd nodded, but her response didn't slow his heart down. He could sense that there was more behind that reassuring smile. As soon as the flight attendant walked away, Todd looked again at the flashing lights on the dashboard. His instinct told him that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something he still couldn't understand. As he leaned back in his seat, Todd found himself wondering what might happen next. The storm outside continued to roar, and the feeling of claustrophobia inside the plane intensified. He knew he should be safe, but at that moment, safety seemed like a fragile promise, about to fall apart at any moment. The turbulence began to subside, and for a brief moment, the interior of the plane seemed to return to normal. The passengers relaxed a little, still tense, but relieved at the reduction in jolts. Todd tried to keep up with the book once more, but his attention kept wandering, focused on the strange events that had occurred up to that point. Then something unexpected happened. A hissing sound came from the cabin speakers, so sudden and loud that all the passengers were startled. Todd looked around, noticing that the crew also seemed alarmed, exchanging uncertain glances as the sound reverberated through the plane. The nearest flight attendant tried to communicate with the cockpit, but her expression soon turned to concern as she heard only static on her radio. Suddenly, the static ceased, replaced by a hoarse, distant voice. Todd and the other passengers remained motionless, trying to catch every word, but the transmission was full of glitches, fragmented and difficult to understand. The voice, however, was clear enough to cause a shiver. "Mayday. Mayday. This is Flight 249. We request assistance. I repeat, Flight 249. We need." There was a sound of louder static, followed by an unsettling silence. Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. Flight 249. Those words seemed to come out of a nightmare. He looked around and saw the fear on the faces of the other passengers, their expressions reflecting the shock he himself felt. The crew was paralyzed, clearly not knowing what to do. Before they could process what they had heard, the voice came again, this time clearer, and what was said made Todd's heart stop for an instant. "Please, we're stuck. There's something on course. Don't go. Divert now." Panic began to spread through the cabin. Murmurs turned into loud voices of concern, and some passengers began to rise from their seats, looking for answers. Todd felt his own heart racing, his breathing becoming faster. What did that message mean? Were they hearing a distress call from a flight in trouble? And what was that route warning? A flight attendant picked up the intercom and tried to calm the passengers, but her own voice was shaking. "Passengers, please remain in your seats. We are investigating the source of the transmission. There is no need to panic. The situation is under control." Her words, however, did little to reassure everyone. Todd could see the doubt in her eyes. She didn't believe what she was saying, and the passengers could tell. The atmosphere on the plane was one of palpable tension, every sound amplified by the heavy silence that settled in. Todd turned his gaze to the window, staring out at the darkness outside. Flight 249. Had he heard of this number before? He tried to remember, but his mind was confused, cluttered with contradictory information. Something was terribly wrong, and he knew that the cryptic message was just the beginning of a series of events that they couldn't control. As Todd tried to organize his thoughts, the static returned to the speakers, followed by another incomprehensible transmission. This time, he could hear another fragment of the message, which made his blood run cold. "Danger ahead. We repeat, danger." The message was lost in noise, but the impact had already been made. Todd felt a primitive fear settle in his chest. This was no simple technical glitch. It was a warning, an alert coming from somewhere, from some time. He looked towards the front of the plane, towards the cabin, with the feeling that they were being watched, that something unknown and sinister was lurking, waiting in the middle of the storm. Whatever was happening, Todd knew it was beyond his comprehension, and all he could do was wait and hope that the crew knew what to do to avoid the imminent threat. The plane was plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the occasional sound of static that still echoed through the speakers. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, many muttering to each other in hushed tones. Todd watched the crew, especially an older flight attendant, who seemed to have turned pale since the first mysterious transmission was picked up. The steward, a grey-haired man called Mark, was known for his experience and calmness in difficult situations. However, now he was standing in the corridor, staring at the loudspeaker as if he had seen a ghost. Todd noticed the expression of recognition in Mark's eyes and decided to act. He undid his seatbelt and stood up, moving towards Mark. "Do you know where that transmission came from?" asked Todd, his voice low and urgent. Mark hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to answer. Finally, he gestured for Todd to follow him to the galley, the small kitchen in the middle of the plane, where they could talk more privately. Other crew members were there, with expressions of uncertainty and fear. Todd felt his stomach tighten as he waited for the explanation. I recognize that voice," Mark began, his voice still shaky. "Many years ago, when I was a young flight attendant, I heard stories about a flight that disappeared in a storm similar to this. It was Flight 249. They never found the plane or the passengers. All that remained was a series of radio transmissions picked up by other flights in the area. They were asking for help, talking about something en route, but no one could decipher what it was. After a while, the transmission stopped. Everyone thought it was just an aviation legend, until now." Todd remained silent, trying to absorb what Mark had just said. So that voice was the pilot of a flight that had been missing for decades. How was it possible that they were hearing these transmissions now, in the present? "Are you saying that we're hearing a message from a plane that disappeared years ago?" Todd asked incredulously. "That doesn't make sense. How could that be possible?" Mark shook his head, unable to answer. "I don't know. Maybe it's some kind of interference, a repetition of old signals due to the storm. Or maybe it's something we don't understand yet. But what worries me most is the warning. If they were trying to warn us about something en route, we should take it seriously." The tension in the small kitchen was palpable. Todd looked at the other crew members, who seemed as lost as he was. Finally, one of the co-pilots appeared, his expression determined. "We need to inform the captain," said the co-pilot, "and we need to decide whether to change course or not. We can't just ignore a distress call, even if it comes from a plane that has disappeared. The storm is getting stronger, and if there's anything out there..." Before he could finish, the speakers again emitted a static sound, and the anguished voice of the missing pilot sounded again, this time louder and clearer. "I repeat, Flight 249. Danger ahead. Divert now. We don't have much time." The words echoed in Todd's mind as he tried to process what it meant. It was no longer just a strange transmission. It was a real distress call, coming from a place where time seemed to have folded in on itself. The crew exchanged glances, and Todd saw the fear in Mark's eyes. They knew that the decision they would make in the next few hours could mean the difference between life and death for everyone on board. With a determined nod, Mark turned to the co-pilot. "Let's talk to the captain now. We need to decide what to do before it's too late." Todd watched as they walked out of the galley towards the cockpit, feeling the weight of uncertainty on his shoulders. He knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. The flight had become more than just a trip. Now, it was a race against time and the unknown. And Todd had no choice but to keep going, hoping that they would find a way out of this bizarre and dangerous situation. The tension in the cabin of the plane was palpable as Captain Williams listened attentively to the concerns of Mark and the co-pilot. Todd, who had followed discreetly to the cabin door, was attentive, picking up fragments of the conversation. The captain's face, normally calm and controlled, was now marked by an expression of deep concern. "Do you want us to divert course because of a transmission that could just be radio interference?" asked Captain Williams, trying to maintain a neutral tone of voice, but letting a note of skepticism shine through. "We have hundreds of lives on board, and changing course in the middle of a storm could be dangerous." Mark nodded, clearly understanding the captain's concerns. "I know it sounds crazy, Captain, but as I said, I recognize the voice. It's identical to the recordings of Flight 249 that were archived after it disappeared. I can't ignore that. And the warning, they ask us to change course. Maybe it's better to risk a change than to go ahead without knowing what's waiting for us." Captain Williams ran a hand over his face, thoughtful. He knew Mark's reputation as an experienced and reliable professional. If Mark was taking this seriously, then perhaps he should also consider the possibility. The storm outside wasn't making the decision any easier. Lightning lit up the sky from time to time, and the plane was still rocking in the strong winds. The conditions were far from ideal for any kind of risky maneuver. "What if it's just a coincidence?" the captain insisted. "What if this transmission is from a pirate radio or interference from another aircraft? We could be putting ourselves in danger for nothing." The co-pilot, who until then had been silent, intervened. "Captain, the chances of interference replicating the recordings of Flight 249 exactly are minimal. Besides, if there is any truth to it, if there is some kind of danger on the current route, we need to consider the safety of the passengers. We can't ignore a distress call, even if it comes from an unlikely source." There was a moment of silence as everyone in the cabin pondered what had been said. Todd, still standing by the door, could feel his heart racing. He didn't know what the captain's decision would be, but it was clear that any choice would involve risks. Finally, Captain Williams sighed, seeming to give in to the pressure. "Very well. I don't like the idea of going ahead without fully understanding what's going on. Well, divert course, but with caution. Keep an eye on the instruments and any sign of trouble. Well, return to the original course immediately." Mark and the co-pilot nodded, clearly relieved by the decision. Todd, watching from outside, felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Changing course seemed like the sensible decision, but it also brought with it a new set of uncertainties. What was really on that original path that the occupants of Flight 249 wanted to avoid at all costs? The captain picked up the intercom and made an announcement to the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a message from your captain. As a precautionary measure, we have decided to adjust our route due to the adverse weather conditions. There is no cause for concern, and our priority is to ensure the safety of everyone on board. We ask that you remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened while we make these adjustments." The response was a murmur of anxious voices, but the passengers seemed to trust the captain's words. The crew began to circulate around the cabin, checking that everyone was safe and trying to reassure the most nervous. Todd returned to his seat, his heart still pounding. The feeling that something out of the ordinary was about to happen didn't leave him alone. He looked out of the window, seeing only darkness interrupted by flashes of lightning. The storm seemed to be everywhere, surrounding the plane like an impenetrable wall. As the plane began to change course, Todd couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. The message from Flight 249 was clear. There was danger ahead, but what kind of danger could threaten a modern airplane in mid-flight? Todd closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his mind. He knew that the next few hours would be critical. The decision to divert course had been made, and now all they could do was move on and hope that they had made the right choice. The change of course initially seemed like a prudent decision. The plane stabilized, and the storm seemed to lose some of its intensity. The crew kept busy, checking the instruments and monitoring communication with the air traffic controllers who had not yet been informed of the change. Todd looked out of the window, trying to detect any change in the landscape below, but all he could see was impenetrable darkness and occasional flashes of lightning. The tension on board seemed to ease slightly. Some passengers began to doze off again, while others were distracted by their devices. Todd tried to read his book once more, but the story couldn't hold his attention. His thoughts still revolved around the transmission and the cryptic words from Flight 249. He couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was approaching. It was then that an alert sounded in the cabin, an insistent beep that set Todd's heart racing. He looked around, noticing that other passengers were also alarmed, looking for signs of what might have caused the sound. Mark, the flight attendant, walked quickly down the aisle towards the cabin, his face once again pale and tense. Todd couldn't help himself. He undid his seatbelt and followed Mark, stopping near the cockpit door, trying to hear what was going on. Inside the cockpit, low, urgent voices were discussing something, and he could only catch parts of what they were saying. Systems failing. It doesn't make sense. All the readings were normal. Mark entered the cabin and closed the door behind him, leaving Todd outside, anxious. After a few moments of agony, the door opened again, and Mark stepped out with an alert expression. Todd couldn't help but approach him. "What's going on, Mark? What does that alarm mean?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering, measuring his words. "It seems that some of our navigation systems have started to fail. We're trying to find out why, but everything was working perfectly before the change of course." Todd felt a chill run down his spine. "Do you think this has something to do with the message from Flight 249? They warned of a danger." "We don't know yet," replied Mark, cutting Todd off. "But we're doing our best to resolve the situation. The captain is still in control, and for the time being, there's no reason to panic." But Mark's words weren't enough to calm the unease growing inside Todd. He returned to his seat, but couldn't bring himself to sit down. Instead, he stood next to his seat, looking at the other passengers. They all seemed restless, picking up on the crew's tension. Suddenly, the plane's loudspeakers hissed again, startling all the passengers. This time, however, the static was followed by a different voice from the first, clearer and closer, as if it were being transmitted from a location much closer than they had imagined. "Flight 249 to any aircraft. Repeat, Flight 249 to any aircraft. There is something en route. A force. Do not follow. Danger." The message was cut off by static, but the effect was immediate. Fear spread through the cabin like wildfire. People began to whisper in panic, asking what was going on. The crew tried to calm the passengers, but their own expressions of fear and uncertainty only served to amplify the tension. Todd felt his throat go dry. That was the same flight number he had heard before, but now it seemed so close, as if it were only a few miles away. He knew they needed to find out what was causing these transmissions and what the warning meant, but he also knew that somehow they were getting involved in something much bigger than a simple storm or communication failure. "We've got to find out what's going on," Todd muttered to himself, squeezing into the seat in front of him. "Something's watching us. Something we shouldn't have found." As the words resonated in his mind, Todd realized that the alarm in the cabin had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. The plane continued on its altered course, but now it seemed to be being sucked in by an invisible presence, something that was pushing them towards the unknown. Whatever was out there, they were about to meet it, and Todd had a terrifying feeling that they weren't prepared for what they would discover. As the flight continued on its new route, Todd couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Even though the storm was calming down around the plane, the air seemed charged with a strange electricity, as if lightning was about to explode at any moment. The passengers were restless, and an almost tangible tension hung in the air. Todd tried to look out of the window again, searching for some sign of what could be causing those enigmatic transmissions. It was then that he saw something that made his heart almost stop. Through the darkness, he glimpsed a point of light flickering in the distance, like a lone star in the night sky. But this light didn't seem to be part of the firmament. It was at the same altitude as the plane, and approaching slowly. He pressed his face against the window, trying to get a better view. The light flashed once more, and for a brief moment, Todd thought he saw the silhouette of another plane, a vague, indistinct shape against the dark background of the night. It was as if it were emerging from the shadows themselves, a metallic ghost emerging from oblivion. "Todd, are you all right?" Mark's voice brought him back, making him turn around quickly. The steward was watching him with a worried expression. Todd took a deep breath, pointing to the window. "I saw something out there," he said, his voice laced with anxiety. "I think I saw another plane, or at least a light that looked like an airplane." Mark frowned, but before he could reply, the speakers squawked once more, and the voice of Flight 249 echoed through the cabin again. This time, however, the voice was accompanied by a background sound, an indistinct noise that sounded like wind, or perhaps the whisper of distant voices. "Flight 249. Total systems failure. No way out. Danger." The message was repeated twice before dissolving back into static. But in that brief interval, Todd had a fleeting vision of a cockpit shrouded in shadows, with lights flashing erratically, and the pale faces of the pilots staring straight ahead, terror evident in their eyes. He blinked, and the vision disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Mark, standing next to Todd, paled. That's not possible," he muttered, his eyes wide. "I swear I heard it before. Exactly those words. It was the original recording of Flight 249. How is it possible that we're hearing it now?" Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. Something was connecting the present to the past, bending time and space in a way he couldn't understand. The words from Flight 249 were not just ancient echoes, but real and present warnings, as if the two planes were coexisting in the same space, separated only by a thin veil of reality. Maybe we're entering some kind of anomaly," Todd suggested, struggling to make sense of the words coming out of his mouth. "Something that's mixing things up, the past and the present, all together, as if time were distorted." Mark shook his head, still trying to process what Todd was saying. "Whatever it is, we can't just ignore it. We need to do something." Before they could argue further, the cabin lights began to flicker and a high-pitched hum filled the air, increasing the sense of panic among the passengers. The speakers squawked again, and for a moment, everyone clearly heard something that made Todd's blood run cold. It was the sound of deep, drawn-out breathing, as if someone was breathing into the microphone. Then a soft voice, almost a whisper, filled the cabin. It wasn't the voice of the pilot of Flight 249. It was something darker, more ancient, and it seemed to come from a place beyond human comprehension. "You shouldn't be here." The message echoed in the silence that followed, leaving everyone in the cabin paralyzed with fear. Todd felt a deep shiver run through his body. Those words weren't just a warning, they were a sentence. As the lights continued to flash, Todd realized that the tension was building. There was something in the air, something he couldn't see, but could feel. A weight, a presence that pressed against him, suffocating him. He knew that time was running out, and that if they didn't find a way out, they would be trapped forever in that nightmare, intertwined with the past. "We need to get to the captain," said Todd, finally finding his voice. "He needs to know what's going on." before it's too late. As Todd and Mark made their way to the cockpit, the feeling that they were being watched became even stronger. The passengers, sensing the tension among the crew, whispered uneasily, exchanging worried glances. The atmosphere was imbued with a sense of unreality, as if every movement was muffled by an invisible force. The air seemed denser, heavier, almost as if the plane was flying through something thicker than the atmosphere. Todd knocked on the cabin door, hoping to be answered quickly. The sound echoed, a hollow noise that sounded strange in the midst of the nervous silence that had settled in. The door opened, and Captain Williams looked at them with a worried look, clearly aware that something more than just a technical glitch was going on. "Captain, we need to talk," said Todd, his tone urgent. "There's more at stake here than simply a storm or a communication failure." Mark nodded. "We heard the message from Flight 249 again, and Todd saw something outside. A light, maybe another plane. We're not alone here." The captain frowned. "Another plane? We have no confirmation of other air traffic in this area. And the message? It could just be interference. But I admit that none of this makes sense. Our systems are starting to show confusing readings. It's as if we're being pulled in two different directions." Todd felt a wave of panic when he heard this. "Captain, what if it's not interference? What if these messages are real somehow? If we're hearing Flight 249 because it's still here somehow?" Captain Williams hesitated. "Are you suggesting that we're trapped in some kind of temporal overlap? That's impossible." "I don't know if it's impossible," replied Todd, his face pale but resolute. "But all the evidence points to something very strange. Perhaps the storm has put us in a situation where time and space don't work as they should." The co-pilot, who had been watching silently, finally spoke up. "Captain, perhaps we should consider the possibility. What if the coordinates we received from Flight 249 are correct? What if we follow the warning and change course again, but this time more drastically? Maybe that could get us out of this anomaly." Captain Williams pondered, clearly reluctant to make such a risky decision. But the evidence that something very wrong was happening was there, clear and disturbing. Finally, he nodded, an expression of determination replacing the hesitation. "Let's do it. Get ready to change course once again. Let's try to get this plane away from whatever is holding us here." Todd and Mark returned to the main cabin, while the captain and co-pilot began to adjust the plane's controls. Todd watched out of the window as the horizon changed, the plane slowly turning in a new direction. There was a tense calm in the cabin, the kind of calm that precedes an even bigger storm. As the plane followed its new course, Todd felt a subtle change in the air. The feeling of heaviness that had been pressing against them seemed to ease a little, but it didn't disappear completely. He looked at the other passengers, seeing the concern on their faces. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't understand what. Mark stopped next to Todd, his face pale. "Do you think this is going to work? That we're really getting out of the way of Flight 249? "I don't know," Todd admitted. "But we have to try. If there's a chance of escaping from this place, we have to take it." Suddenly, a new sound filled the cabin. A low, steady moan, like the wail of a distant creature. Everyone froze, and Todd realized that the sound was coming from the plane itself, as if the metal was bending under an invisible pressure. The lights began to flicker again, and the plane shook, a deep shudder that made everyone cling to their seats. "It can't just be time and space," whispered Todd, as the groaning increased. "It's as if, like we're being pulled into something." It was then that he saw through the window again. The light he had seen before was back, but now it was closer, and he could make out more details. There was an outline, the distinct shape of an airplane emerging from the darkness. It wasn't a modern plane. It was old, with a design that Todd vaguely recognized from photos of aircraft from the 70s, and it was moving somehow side by side with them, like a reflection in a broken mirror. "Flight 249, Todd muttered, his voice almost inaudible. He knew that's what it was. Somehow, against all the laws of physics and logic, That plane that had disappeared decades ago was here, navigating the same dark sky as them. The realization hit him with overwhelming force. Before he could say anything, the sound on the speakers changed again. The voice of Flight 249 sounded clearer, more desperate, filling the cabin with an urgency that chilled the blood of everyone on board. "They're coming, from the dark. Don't go any further. Divert. Divert." The message was cut off by a scream, a sound of pure despair, before everything fell silent. The groaning of the plane ceased, and for a moment that seemed to last an eternity. Time seemed to stop. Todd closed his eyes, trying to calm his mind. He knew they were close to discovering the secret of Flight 249, but he also knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. They were at a threshold, a point where reality bent, and one false step could condemn everyone on board to a fate worse than death. "We have to get out of here," Todd told Mark, his voice firm. "Whatever's out there, we have to get away before it reaches us." The cabin of the plane was in a state of almost controlled chaos. The tension grew by the minute, and the disquieting sound that filled the air seemed to be affecting everyone on board. The lights flashed intermittently, and the passengers clung to their seats, frightened and confused. Todd, Mark, and the crew were all on edge, and the feeling that something catastrophic was about to happen was palpable. Captain Williams continued to adjust the controls, trying to stabilize the aircraft, while the co-pilot monitored the systems with an expression of growing concern. Todd and Mark, observing the situation, could feel the weight of the decision they were about to make. The message from Flight 249 still echoed in their minds, and the presence of the phantom aircraft from the past was a constant source of terror. "Captain, you have to tell us what to do," Mark shouted, his voice filled with panic. "We're being pulled into something we don't understand. What are we supposed to do?" Captain Williams looked at Mark, the tiredness and fear visible on his face. "We're trying to find out if there's any way to stabilize the flight, or if there's anything we can do to avoid the presence of this unknown force. But we don't know what's causing it, or how to get out of this situation." Todd approached, trying to remain calm. "We need to do something drastic. If Flight 249 was trying to warn us, perhaps the best thing is to try to take the opposite route to the one we're on now. If there's any logic to what we're facing, it may be that the solution is to find a way out that's the opposite of the original route." "Do you think they were forced to follow a specific route? What if the change of course could lead us to a safe zone?" the captain asked, trying to hold on to any hope. "Yes," replied Todd. "If we're in the same timeline or dimensional space as they were, we may need to go in the opposite direction to escape the influence of this thing that's here." Captain Williams gestured to the co-pilot, who began recalculating the new course based on Todd's suggestion. The lights on the control panel flashed even brighter, and the aircraft shook with a shudder that made the passengers scream with fear. The sound that filled the cabin increased in volume, making the atmosphere almost unbearable. The cabin became even darker when the emergency lights started flashing. The captain made an announcement over the intercom system, trying to calm the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm and stay in your seats. We are doing everything possible to resolve the situation." Todd watched the sky through the window, seeing the distant light of the ghost plane flashing with disturbing intensity. There was a feeling that time was stretching out, as if the plane was traveling through a space where normal rules no longer applied. When the captain gave the final order to change course drastically, the plane began to turn, moving slowly towards the new course. The impact was immediate. The turbulence seemed to subside, but the sound that filled the cabin continued, now with an almost human wailing quality. "We're making it!" Mark shouted, trying to stay hopeful. "It looks like we're heading for a calmer area." But suddenly a new transmission came over the loudspeakers, interrupting the brief sense of relief. It was the same desperate voice from Flight 249, but now it sounded more intense, closer. "It's no use. They're getting closer. The shadow. It's close. There's no escape." The message was interrupted by a high-pitched scream, and the flashing lights increased in intensity, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. The plane shook again, and a metallic tearing sound filled the air, as if the very hull of the aircraft was being torn apart. Todd turned to the captain. "We need to know if there's anything we can do to uncover the source of this force. If there's no way out of this, maybe we have to face what's chasing us." The captain, his face now more determined, nodded. "Then let's face it. Stay calm and be prepared for anything." The plane continued to fly its new route, but the feeling that something was getting closer grew. Every tremor, every strange sound seemed to be pushing them towards an inevitable confrontation with the unknown. Time seemed to pass more slowly, and every minute on board was a struggle against growing fear and uncertainty. Todd knew they were getting closer to a resolution, but he also understood that whatever was out there wouldn't let them go without a final confrontation. They were about to encounter what Flight 249 had tried to avoid at all costs. As the plane continued on its way, Todd looked at the other passengers. The fear in their eyes reflected the same terror he felt. They were all on the edge of an abyss, and the only hope was that the route they had chosen might somehow offer a way out. The fate of the flight now depended on facing what was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension on the plane had reached an unbearable point. The emergency lights were still flashing, casting a frantic glow over the tense faces of the passengers. Todd watched out of the window, his gaze fixed on the distant light that seemed to follow the plane ever closer, as if waiting for the right moment to strike. Captain Williams and the crew were focused on keeping the plane stable, fighting against the increasing turbulence and strange interference that continued to haunt the cabin. The sound of creaking metal and constant whining filled the air, making every second a harrowing experience. "We're approaching the new calculated route," informed the co-pilot, his tone tense. "We should be passing through an area where the influence of the anomaly should diminish." Todd turned to Mark, who was standing next to him, an expression of determination mixed with a dose of fear. "We have to prepare for anything. If the presence we feel is real, it won't let us escape without a confrontation." Mark nodded, his gaze fixed on the cabin. "Let's stay alert." Suddenly, the plane shook with intense force, and a deep rumble made everyone in the cabin clutch their hands. The control panel was flashing with warning lights, and the sound of wailing increased in volume, filling the cabin with an almost deafening noise. Todd noticed that the distant light was now visibly closer, a metallic shadow that seemed to draw ever closer. "We're close to the critical point," shouted Captain Williams, struggling to maintain control. "Prepare for any eventuality." The cabin was in a state of controlled chaos, with passengers screaming and trying to stay safe. The light Todd had seen earlier was now visibly on the side of the plane, and he could make out the shape of Flight 249, floating next to them like a metallic specter. "Look!" Todd shouted, pointing to the window. "Flight 249 is right next to it." Mark approached Todd, his eyes wide. "It's like a mirror, a reflection of the past." Captain Williams made another announcement, trying to remain calm. "We're in a critical situation. The plane you're seeing is a manifestation of something we don't fully understand. Our priority now is to stabilize the aircraft and ensure the safety of everyone on board." The turbulence was intensifying, and the sound of wailing seemed to be coming directly from Flight 249, a distorted voice full of despair. Captain Williams and the co-pilot continued to adjust the controls, trying to find a way to stabilize the aircraft and minimize the influence of the anomaly. Suddenly, the cabin was filled with a new message, a transmission that sounded like a direct shout from the passengers of Flight 249. The voice was desperate, almost inaudible due to the deafening noise, but the words were clear. "Don't go any further. The shadow is getting closer. The message was cut off by an agonizing scream, and the flashing lights became more intense, creating an almost apocalyptic atmosphere. The plane shook violently, and everyone in the cabin was now in a state of pure panic. "We're crossing the area of greatest influence," shouted the co-pilot, hard of hearing over the noise. "We need a contingency plan now." Captain Williams made a final, drastic decision. "Well, try an evasive maneuver. Well, change altitude and direction abruptly. That could take us out of the zone of influence." The cabin prepared for the maneuver, and the plane made a sudden change in altitude and direction, moving in a sharp trajectory. The turbulence increased, and the sound of wailing seemed to reach a climax. Everyone on board was clutching their seats, their faces pale and panicked cries echoing through the cabin. With a final bang, the cabin was filled with a sudden silence. The noise and turbulence abruptly ceased, and the emergency lights began to stabilize. The plane was now flying more smoothly, and the light from Flight 249 had disappeared, leaving the sky dark and empty. Todd looked around, watching as the passengers gradually began to relax. Panic gave way to a hesitant silence as everyone tried to process what had happened. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of relief mixed with a deep sense of uncertainty. Captain Williams made a final announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have managed to stabilize the flight. The influence of the anomaly seems to have diminished, and we are on our way to a safe area. We thank you for your patience and cooperation during this exceptional situation." Todd and Mark sat back, exhausted and relieved. They had faced the unknown and survived an experience that defied all logic and understanding, but they knew that what had happened was not something they could easily forget. As the plane continued its flight, Todd looked out of the window, observing the dissipating clouds and the starry sky. The feeling that they had narrowly escaped was still there, but there was also a new realization that they had faced something beyond human understanding. Flight 249 had become a living legend, a silent warning to those who crossed the path of a force beyond comprehension. And as the plane flew away from the storm and the shadow of the past, Todd knew that the experience had changed his perception of the world forever. The mystery of Flight 249 remained, but now they were free, at least for the time being.